for. It seems like it doesn't matter what you point to. The fact that you can point to like the gay rights movement, to feminism, even to industrial abortion, and still say that, ultimately there's some Christian influence going on here, makes me think that you're mischaracterizing me there.
You're mischaracterizing me there.
God gave them permission to take slaves from the nations around them. If God was anti-slavery, he would have put an end to it full stop there and then. But he wasn't. And so, what does this mean? Is that it seems like basically anything that the West does or is said to do can in some vague way be traced back to the Bible or the Christian tradition in one way or another. Now, if that's not the case, because that would be a little bit too weak of a principle, what would be a falsifying condition? Like, if there was something that were true in the West, something that people did, something that people accepted morally, is there an example of such a thing that would make you say, okay, that's not grounded in Christianity? Yeah. In a way that you don't think I could pull a similar trick of sort of saying, but this biblical story or this church tradition or whatever. Like, can you think of an example of something society could be doing that would disallow you, that would falsify the idea that it's Christian in origin?
So this is actually the difference between me and Tom, which is not the difference that you identified. The difference between me and Tom is for me to be able to say, I think there is a Christianity beyond which we have developed ideas, and we've developed ideas with Romanticism, for instance. Yeah. Again, Romanticism is unthinkable without this tradition of the person that's come, through the scriptures and through meditation on the persons of the Trinity, and there's definitely some very Christian backstory to the individual. We invented the individual, Larry Seidentop's great book, but we've also invented individualism. We've got this intense first personal sense that I think has turned into a romanticized kind of self, and takes the West in all sorts of directions contra to what the Bible is. So I'm not trying to make the point that, it's easy to say the modern West is very pro-gay and the Bible's very anti-gay, and I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that, because if I said that to you, if I said, the LGBT movement is anti-Bible, you could say, yeah, but the motivations behind the LGBT movement are essentially Christian. What I'm saying is, can you think of a single example of something the West could be doing that would make you say, actually, no, that's definitely not Christian? Industrial scale abortion?
Okay, right. So if, and you don't think the West is doing that?
It's totally doing that.
So when you say
that, that's not very Christian.
So when you say that Western civilization, warts and all, is indebted to Christianity, this is an example of a massive part of modern Western culture, which has got nothing to do with Christianity. It's actually contra Christianity.
100%.
But many people, if you ask people on the street, I think popular consensus, especially in the UK, is that abortion is fine, at least up to a certain point. It seems to be a settled issue here.
Yeah.
So the air that those people are breathing is profoundly unchristian.
Which I say in the book. And what I say in the book is, what's fascinating at that point is that they're doing what is I consider to be a pagan practice for some profoundly Christian reasons. And it's healthcare, right? It's about bodily autonomy and rights.
Look, I asked you a second ago for an example of something which you would say is not not an example of a flourishing of Christianity. You said industrial abortion. Yep. When I said, well, that means it's not Christian, you said, but they're actually doing a very Christian thing.
No, they're not doing a Christian thing.
You said that they're motivated by Christian principles.
No, I don't think they're motivated by Christian principles. I just think the way you are able to forward some quite pagan ends in a modern society, and there's lots of pagan stuff that we do, you do tend to have to use some Christian language in order to do it, or Christian-ish language in order to do something profoundly un-Christian.
Okay, so once again then, we've sort of landed on this thing, industrial abortion, which you say that to buttress in Western civilization, you need to use Christian language. What I'm looking for is a falsifying condition then, something which the West could be doing, which you could not make that argument for. It seems like it doesn't matter what you point to. The fact that you can point to the gay rights movement, to feminism, even to industrial abortion, and still say that, ultimately there's some Christian influence going on here, makes me think that you're
mischaracterizing me there. You're mischaracterizing me there quite substantially there. I think it's a totally pagan practice, which we are heading full steam towards. I think euthanasia is another kind of pagan practice that is utterly in keeping with paganism, not in keeping with Christianity. But even the reasons that are given for it Some of them are starting to be reasons, such as, well, the NHS is creaking at the seams, and this might be cheaper. Some of those sorts of justifications are being given, which are pagan kinds of justifications for pagan kinds of practices. But you're looking for falsifiability when we're not talking about science. Okay, so falsifiability works brilliantly if you've got population A, population B, and a control group, and let's run the experiment, and let's look at the results, and we'll ABC test it. Okay, you cannot do that with the past. You literally, we look back at the past. There is not A, B, or C past. There is only A, and that A has been 20 centuries of some very profound Christianization, and we've come out the other end of 20 centuries of very strong Christianization. And the extraordinary thing is that so many people are able to think of Tom Holland's thesis as wild, or, it's an incredibly modest thesis, which I think is quite obvious. And it's quite obvious to everyone else around the world. When everyone else comes to the UK, they're just like, well, I've come to a Christian country, haven't I?
You think that?
Right.
You think people come to the UK and think, wow, how profoundly Christian this place is?
Yeah.
You think you walk around
Have you talked to immigrants? They come. I've come to this country. It seems to be a Christian country. Now, devout Muslims might look into the West and think, this is what Christianity is. It has become so decadent. It is so self-obsessed, etc., etc., etc. But their idea, because they don't have a separation of church and state, because they don't have the secular. I mean, this is impossible to prove. I mean, I don't know. I suppose it depends on who you ask. But anybody listening, if they visited the UK, like walked around London and thought, wow, how profoundly Christian everything is here. I'd like to speak from another religious point of view. From another religious point of view, a Chinese person comes to the UK. They are thinking that it's Christian, right? Right. A Muslim person comes to the UK. They say, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who we've both spoken to, when she went to the Netherlands, she just thought it was a Christian country, right? I guess
we should avoid this. This is essentially like it's almost anecdotal, but the people who give the anecdotes aren't even here. So this is kind of an impossible thread to follow.
But my point is that the falsifiability thing is illegitimate, because counterfactuals in history are just notoriously...
The reason I'm asking is because, for example, if I were to say, and this is an oversimplification, but if I were to say something like, I think that Western civilization is profoundly vegan, you would say, I don't think that's true, because the West might,
because let's look at the history.
Because the West just like serves hot dogs like all over the place, and it'd be like, okay, actually fair enough. That shows that maybe society isn't vegan. Now, if we lived in a vegan world where everyone was vegan, and I could say, the West is profoundly vegan, you might ask me, yeah, but you could say that about anything. What would be an example of a reality where you wouldn't be able to say that? And I would say, well, if people were serving, hot dogs everywhere, I don't think it would be vegan. And that would be that. What I'm saying is, if you want to say that the West we find ourselves in is profoundly Christian, I'm saying, what could be true about the West that would make it unchristian?
I think we're missing each other.
All right. Maybe. But you get the question I'm asking now? Like, what could be true
if you can connect
about the West that would make it unchristian?
Yeah.
What Alex is pushing here is actually a basic standard in reasoning: falsifiability. If a claim can explain everything, then it explains nothing. Saying, everything good in the West comes from Christianity sounds strong, but if you can't name a single thing that would disprove it, it stops being a testable idea. We know from history and science that moral progress in the West didn't come from one source. Ideas like individual rights and freedom also grew from Enlightenment philosophy, thinkers like John Locke, and from social evolution, not just religion. Even the Bible itself reflects moral limits of its time. For example, Book of Leviticus 25:44-46 explicitly allows owning slaves from other nations. That's not a modern moral standard, it's a historical one. So when people say modern values are Christian, what we're really seeing is a mix of cultural evolution, philosophy, and human reasoning over time, not a single origin story.
I think we've all and this is what I was trying to communicate back at the beginning. Whereas you said about blossoming, everything that happens within the West is just a further blossoming of what Christianity is. What I'm trying to say is, no, I think there are things that are Christian and things that are not, and I think there's ways of crossing over that line in some quite decisive ways. We've spoken about, and interestingly, abortion and euthanasia are about the dignity of the human person and Imago Dei issues, if you ask me. So, and I think there are many more like that. So I'm not saying that everything in the West is Christian, but I am saying that the history that has got us here has been profoundly Christianized, and I don't think people properly acknowledge that.
It's the air we breathe, right? And what I'm asking is in a country where abortion is essentially a settled issue, that Christians protest against, but like politically, it would be insane to imagine like a sort of a thoroughgoing pro-life movement getting going in Parliament. I mean, maybe one day, but at least for now, is the air that they're breathing Christian?
The moral intuitions that they are using to argue for a profoundly pagan practice are to do with gender equality, the rights of...
So is there anything that you could not say that about?
Yeah, if it's just, I don't care, right? Shout your abortion. That's not Christian. Like I think you're mistaking me for...
And obviously you feel that this falsification thing that Alex wants to press on here isn't necessarily the way to look at history. I mean, to some extent, I understand Glenn saying here that actually, in a sense, yes, everything has some root in Christianity because the West is so thoroughly influenced by it. But not everything is therefore Christian that comes out of that, because obviously it goes off in different directions. But even the things that are not Christian have tended to be justified still by reference to Christian ideals. I want to just have a quick gear change here, and it's been absolutely brilliant, and I've been enjoying every moment of it. But so far, the conversation has been very much you brilliantly testing Glenn's thesis here, Alex, and I want to maybe sort of shift things a little bit more to kind of, okay, where does Alex get his? Where is your view on all of this in terms of the idea of a fundamental moral reality of ideas around compassion, progress, freedom, equality, and all of those things? One of the sort of chapters of Glenn's book is called Choose Your Miracle, and he's essentially saying, look, this idea that in the secular West, these ideas of compassion, equality, progress, and so on have just kind of come out of the ether is a sort of miraculous claim. It's a sort of, no, they have to be grounded in something. Glenn's case is they're grounded in the Christian story, and that's grounded ultimately in the idea of there being a God who creates a moral universe out of which we are, essentially judged against. Do you have a view as an atheist of what this morality is? Is it something that is just essentially a byproduct of a socio-cultural evolutionary process which works and people get on with and produces the kind of goods that our self-interest and survival are prone towards? Do you have any sense that there is a kind of fundamental moral reality that actually exists, some Platonic realm perhaps?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, all right.
I mean,
well, tell us where you are, and I'd just love to hear Glenn sort of teasing that out, as well as to what your grounding is. Glenn's is obviously that we need the Christian story to make sense of these ideals. I suspect you've got a different account.
Well, I'm an ethical emotivist.
Okay.
I think that ethical expressions are emotional expressions, and it's a lot of people find that quite troubling. You might say, oh, but then how can you say this is objectively wrong and that's, and it's like, well, like I can't. I don't think that objective morality exists. I mean,
just for the folk who are watching or listening who don't have the background in ethical emotivism, just a brief summary of what
I don't think that there is some truth in the universe that exists, that there are these qualities called goodness and badness and should and shouldn't that are real and actually exist and are true in the same way this table exists right here. I don't think that's the case. I think that when you pay attention to what you're doing, when you're moralizing, you're essentially expressing an emotion. It's not the same as ethical subjectivism, right? Like, famously, for an ethical emotivist, if you say that murder is wrong, it's like sort of saying the word murder and then putting an angry emoji and an exclamation mark next to it. It doesn't have truth value. It's not the kind of thing that can be true or false. It's not, well, is that just subjectively true, or is it object? It's like, it's an expression. It's not the same thing as, like, murder is wrong doesn't translate to I don't like murder, because that could be true or false. It could be true that I don't like murder. It's a claim about my own psychology. For an emotivist, murder is wrong is just an expression of that distaste. Now, the thing is, for a lot of people, that's very uncomfortable, and we can talk about that if you like. I think it's tangential to the issue of like whether Western values are Christian, because I don't think Western values historically have been emotivist, right? I wouldn't claim that they've been emotivist. I wouldn't claim that like emotivism is going to console you. It's not going to make you feel any better. And if you say to me, but doesn't that sort of leave you in this hole or that hole? I might just say, yeah, it totally does. But I do think that's slightly tangential to the point. I mean, we can talk about it if you like, but I want to emphasize that the reason I'm here is not to provide a better grounding for Western values, like is in their truth. I'm trying to offer a more, I think, fair.
We are moving, obviously, from a sort of historical...
An internal critique of my position to see if it's consistent.
And the issue that I have is it seems like, I mean, an example that comes to mind for me, for example, just sort of picking one out of thin air, as it were, is something like family, right? Let's just take something like family. I can just imagine, right, that if Western civilization had a really strong emphasis on family, in the way that some Asian cultures do, that like it was like one of our most important moral intuitions, that you live with your grandparents and you look after them, people could say, well, this is Christian, because look at the way that the Bible instructs you to honor your father and mother. It's like the only people you honor above your father and mother are God. Like it's so crucial that this is, the most important thing, right? And yet we live in a highly individualistic culture where people don't. They value their family, but not in that kind of way, and we value our own sort of sense of self. But you can imagine an even more individualistic culture that didn't do that at all, and people would still say, oh, but this is foundationally Christian, because look at the way that Jesus said that you should be willing to hate your mother and hate your father and prefer me. Like, it's just so, it doesn't matter which way you go, strong family, anti-family. If we had lived in a world where the abolitionist movement didn't get going and everyone was still okay with slavery, where would people still be pointing to justify it? They'd be pointing to the Bible.
The issue here is consistency. If one text can support opposite moral outcomes, it stops being a clear foundation and starts functioning as a tool people interpret to fit their views. On family, the Bible gives conflicting directions. Book of Exodus 20:12 commands honoring parents, but Luke 14:26 says a follower must hate father and mother in comparison to devotion to Jesus. That creates room to justify both strong family loyalty and distancing from family. The same tension appears with slavery. Epistle to the Ephesians 6:5 instructs slaves to obey masters, and First Epistle to Timothy 6:1 reinforces that structure. These are direct endorsements of a system modern societies reject. Alex's point becomes clearer with this pattern. If a culture supported slavery, those same verses would still be available to justify it. If a culture rejects slavery, people reinterpret or ignore those passages. Outside religion, moral behavior has measurable roots. Studies in evolutionary psychology show cooperation and empathy improve survival in social groups. Primates like chimpanzees display fairness responses and helping behavior without any religious framework.
So it doesn't matter if we have it or we
Is it
don't.
better that abolition has happened?
As an emotivist, I can say yes, but I think I'm expressing an emotion there.
Okay. And as an emotivist, what would you have said in 1800 if you were in the House of Commons and you were called upon, William Wilberforce is sick, Alex O'Connor needs to address the abolitionist cause? What would you say from your...
I'm not sure what I would have said. So I'm not sure if I would have been an emotivist in the 1800s, because I don't think the position had been invented yet. So I might have believed in some kind of objective moral principle that I might have appealed to. I might well have been a Christian and appealed to those principles too, but I might not have been. I might have been like Lincoln, a man who privately was reported to sort of have no belief in Jesus as personal Lord and Saviour, but just had a conviction that something about this was wrong. I don't know what I would have said at the time. But whether or not I could have rightfully condemned slavery then or done so now, I think is a separate question as to whether Christianity is the historical force that caused that abolitionist movement.
Oh, do you doubt that it was Christianity that caused...
In the UK, Wilberforce is, of course, deeply convicted of his religious beliefs, and the man who convinced him to bring it to Parliament, who had written an essay in Latin for Cambridge University about his tutor had just set him this sort of like, is it okay to own other human beings? And he wrote this essay in Latin and was like, hold on a moment. And he reports sort of being on a long journey and feeling like God had spoken to him and he had this mission. Yeah, no doubt. That's the English tradition. In America, I'm not so sure. Certainly not in Haiti. In France, when does abolition happen? Well, after the French Revolution, which is a profoundly secularizing influence on France. So it depends on where you look. In other words, yes, maybe I would be happy to grant that in the UK there is a profoundly Christian element to abolitionism. But to say that it had to be Christian is to ignore what happened in France and to ignore what happened in Haiti, and I think to ignore what happened in America.
So, in France it was reversed by Napoleon.
That's right.
I think because there are some profoundly utilitarian arguments being used alongside a whole bunch of rights language. Where did they get the rights language from? Where did they get some of their campaigns from? And it was the Abolition Society in the UK.
But why was it abolished
France.
before it was reinstated by Napoleon? Why was it abolished?
Why was it abolished? For because of both Christian-ish reasons in terms of rights, and because of some utilitarian arguments, such as David Hume's kind of arguments, that you don't get ingenuity and you don't get industry.
But this is it, isn't it? Within not that long a period of time, we go from the French abolishing it and then reinstating it. And when they abolished it, that was probably due to Christian influence. But when they reinstated it, no, that was nothing to do with Christianity.
I'm just telling you a history of what has happened, and it was reversed. And by the way, France actually abolished slavery in 1400, right? And I mean, slavery, the long slow burn of abolitionism happened in medieval Europe, 700 years earlier, right? So I would say that Christianity abolished slavery twice. One was a long slow burn of a kind of a sacramental approach, and the second was very much a preacher-led abolitionism. But that,
But if you want to own the Christian element of the abolitionist movement, you have to also own the Christian element of the anti-abolitionist movement, which is just as strong.
Sure.
In America, the issue was settled with physical violence.
Yeah.
And if the other side had won, you'd have a just as Christian nation appealing to exactly the same God and the same Bible and the same Christian tradition to say that they were right.
Actually, not the same Bible. They actually did what Marcion proposed. And they did what I hear you wanting to do.
They're talking about the slave Bible.
The slave Bible. To get rid of 90% of the Old Testament and 50%.
90%?
Yeah. And then 50% of the New Testament. Those slave owners were terrified of the Bible. They were terrified of the whole Bible. And I would say that the Bible was in the hands of abolitionist preachers, and Frederick Douglass said that the image of God on page 1 of the Bible was a hammer in the hands of the abolitionists. And I think it was a profoundly spiritual, religious, Christian, evangelical and Quaker-led movement.
In the United Kingdom, I think so, yes. But
which then, through international law, gets rolled out.
Well, maybe, but I don't think it's as simple as that. I mean, the slave Bible, I think, was designed for British colonies. And of course, the slave Bible is not so much... I think people think about this wrong. I think when people look at the slave Bible, they think of it as an edited Bible. But like you say, 90% of the Old Testament is gone. This is not an edited Bible. This is a sort of compilation of biblical quotes. It's a bit like if I had a book that said, here is a book of selected psalms for help in overcoming grief, right? And you gave that to me. I wouldn't say you've taken a Bible and you've edited it and you've censored it. No, it's a collection. Now, what did they take out? Things like the Exodus story. Why? Because people might read the Exodus story and be filled with these delusions of grandeur about...
Which is what the black church was, and that was the Negro spirituals that they sang.
But the question is, who is actually misreading the story of the Exodus? Is it the abolitionists?
And it's not the black church, is it? The black church got it right.
I don't think that they did.
Okay.
I don't think that they did. Because what happened in the Exodus? The Jews were enslaved in Egypt. God makes a promise to Abraham. He fulfills that promise, which starts with the emancipation of the Jews from Egypt. And what is the first thing that the Jews immediately start doing? They start taking slaves of their own from the nations around them. The reason why the Jews were freed from slavery in Egypt is not because God is anti-slavery. It's because the Jews were his chosen people, to the extent that as soon as they were emancipated from the Egyptians, God gave them permission to take slaves from the nations around them. If God was anti-slavery, he would have put an end to it full stop there and then. But he wasn't. And so, what does this mean? It means that the actual, a thorough reading of the Bible, of the Old Testament, will tell you that this Exodus story with these stories of, let my people go, was a profoundly Israelite-specific motivation, that as soon as they left Egypt, they started taking slaves of their own. Now, I have no doubt that if I were a slave owner who was trying to convince my slaves not to want to sort of rise up against me, that if I gave them the Exodus, they might read that and go, hey, we can do what the Israelites did. And that might still be enough reason for me to take it out of the Bible and not let them read it. But to say that that's the message of the Old Testament, I think is profoundly mistaken.
This part exposes a key historical problem. The same Bible was used on both sides of slavery. That alone weakens the idea that Christianity clearly drove abolition. Pro-slavery arguments weren't fringe. They leaned directly on Scripture. Book of Leviticus 25:44-46 allows owning slaves from other nations. An epistle to the Colossians 3:22 tells slaves to obey in everything. Those texts existed the entire time abolition was debated. Abolition also didn't happen in just one Christian path. In Haitian Revolution, enslaved people overthrew the system through revolt. In French Revolution, slavery was abolished in a movement driven by secular ideas like citizenship and equality, then reversed under Napoleon Bonaparte. That shows shifting political and economic forces, not a single religious cause. Then there's the Exodus argument. Even if it inspires freedom, the same narrative leads into a system where Israelites are later permitted to take slaves themselves. That undercuts the claim that the text teaches a universal anti-slavery principle. What you're seeing is interpretation shaped by context. People reached moral conclusions first, then used religion, philosophy, or politics to justify them. So when the same text can be used to defend both slavery and abolition, it raises a real question. Where are our moral standards actually coming from? Do you think morality needs religion to exist? Or do you think it comes from human reasoning and experience over time? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear how you see it. And if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part.